Well, Dr. Nation, I want to thank you very much for spending some of your valuable time talking to us common teachers over in Busan.
Nothing common about teachers, Rocky.
Thank you. I was very pleased to listen to you this morning. You had some very logical and well thought out ideas for us. We'd like to find out a little bit more about them if we may right now.
Yeah, pleasure.
Would you please explain the idea of the general service list and how it impacts us as teachers?
Okay, the general service list was a list developed by Michael West and a group of other researchers, but Michael West was the main driving force. And they were trying to establish a generally acceptable list of high-frequency words that could be used for the design of language courses. I have a suspicion that it was sort of partly inspired by Basic English, where Basic English had their word list, which is worked out on very different principles, but very cleverly done. But they actually had the list, so you could see what the goal was. And I think West and them wanted to have something like that too, where you could say, well, here are the words you really need to learn first and get control of. And it fits in with West's idea of, working systematically through vocabulary, developing vocabulary knowledge, and then relating it to extensive reading at various levels of development throughout a course. So West's New Method English course was a series of books, and at the end of each book, I think it went up to about book 6 or something like that, and at the end of each book you then could read what were then called supplementary readers, but were actually graded readers, at that level of using only the vocabulary you'd studied up to that point. And West tried to produce as many as he could, but I think he probably had about 3 or 4 or 5 at each level. And so there would be probably about 30 or so graded readers associated with the course.
So this service list is a frequency list of common English words.
Very common English words. We want to replace it because it's old, although anyone who's in my classes is not allowed to use the excuse as old as to say something bad about something for obvious reasons. But it's actually a very hard list to replace because it was developed not just through frequency but through a variety of other criteria. And one of the central ones, I think, was that West actually wrote material and produced material using the list. And when he found that there were things he couldn't say because there weren't words in the list to say it, then he would make adjustments to the list. So it was a well sort of trialed list. And when we try to make them with frequency counts, it's really hard to get anything as good as West made. But people are still trying.
But now I think your research said the first 2,000 words are the words that are most useful for foreign language learners?
Yes, they're essential. No matter what use you make of the language, whether it's listening, speaking, reading or writing, whether it's informal or formal use, you need to use those first 2,000 words. In written language, they make up about 80% of the running words, and in spoken language, they make up just over 90% of the running words.
So then the idea of graded readers of extensive reading is to teach that first 2,000 words.
Well, you then have to look at what the goals of extensive reading are, and some people would say the goals of extensive reading are to how would you say, consolidate those words. But you can also see them as opportunities to learn new words and so on. I think you have to see a range of goals for extensive reading, both developing new vocabulary, establishing old vocabulary, developing reading skills and so on. And I think there's probably at least half a dozen sensible goals that you can have with extensive reading.
Yeah. How did you get involved with vocabulary research and whatnot?
Well, I'm always grateful to my teachers because I had colleagues I worked with who were the head of my school, H.V. George, and who was then the senior lecturer in our school, Helen Barnard.
Where's this?
This is in New Zealand.
New Zealand.
And they were both from India. And they'd taught in colleges, teachers training colleges in India and so on. And in many ways they were in the tradition of Michael West, he was sent off to what was then Bengal and now Bangladesh to teach English. And then he soon realized what he should be doing and did some of the really basic research that we have which set up the growth of the vocab movement and extensive reading. And they had a very strong background in vocabulary studies and corpus-based work. And so when I looked at what they were doing, it certainly made sense to me, and I just carried on, I think.
Yeah, but you've carried it to a level of passion.
I hope not too passionate.
Well, what's wrong with passion? Somebody who becomes as good at something, is called a genius.
Well, no, you just work hard, and if you work hard, the results come. Uh-huh. I think that you really need to just keep plugging away at the same thing, really. There's surprisingly not a lot of researchers who actually publish more than 1 or 2 articles on a particular topic, and I think it's important that people keep exploring the same topic so that you can get your methodology better and that you can refine the findings and really start digging deep into areas. Mm-hmm. And I think now we're starting to see that in vocabulary studies. I've just been sort of rewriting a book I published in 2001, and I realized that 30% of the published work on vocabulary studies in the last 110 years has appeared in the last 12 years. So a third of all the research in the last 110 years has appeared in the last 12 years. So there's really an enormous growth now of vocabulary studies. That's really heartening, because I think you can't help but then improve the methodology of your research. And we now have books on the research, a couple of books out this year on researching vocabulary and the methodology of vocabulary research. So I think it's very healthy.
Well, when I started my interest in extensive reading, I almost became an evangelist here in Korea to spread the word. And it was very slow to take off, but now it's become mainstream. We had an international conference last year in Busan. The whole day was spent on extensive reading.
That's great.
But I think the time has come for explicit teaching of vocabulary. And I particularly enjoy your work with the tests, the Koreanized size tests. I'm using your vocabulary books in my classes. Yeah. I think it's time for Koreans to wake up to the need for explicit teaching of vocabulary.
Well, I hesitate on that one. I think there's need for the explicit learning of vocabulary. And I think we have to see the responsibility, the main responsibility for actual learning of vocabulary going to the learner. Because I think teaching of vocabulary is, compared to the actual learner study of vocabulary, is rather inefficient. And I think that, because you can teach a lot of words, but only a few are going to get through. And this, one way of looking at it, it's only occurred to me a couple of months ago, so I went back and looked at some of the research, and I wanted to see, when you do deliberate vocabulary activities and when you do deliberate teaching, or you get learners to keep notebooks, what's the pickup rate, from learning? Because there are experiments like studying what's called the involvement load hypothesis, where they compare different vocab learning activities and then relate it to some analysis of those activities. So they sort of have pre and post tests, and you can see how much was taught and how much was learned.
How much they remember.
Yeah, and what surprised me was that the learning was around about 40%. So that meant about, of every 10 words focused on in these activities and deliberately worked on, only 4 out of the 10 on average would be retained in the immediate follow-up test. And I like better odds than that. I want odds which are nearer to. I'm not a gambler, but I don't want to gamble on 50-50. I want 99% odds before I'll place my money anywhere. So I just think that there are probably more effective ways. That isn't to say that teachers shouldn't teach vocabulary, but you have to see that most learning of vocabulary will not be teacher-led.
Will be personal. Yes.
It'd be learners actually getting in and reading, learning through extensive reading, making their own word cards and doing their own learning and so on. And learners need to be trained how to do that, because there are good ways and bad ways.
Excellent.
And I think if the teachers take on too much teaching time, then that's less time, say, for extensive reading in class, for example. And I'd much rather see that time be spent on extensive reading in class than the teacher getting up and teaching 10 words.
Well, one of my goals in my extensive reading classes is learner empowerment and teaching them that they've got to continue on their own. I'm just showing them how to do it. I'd like to show them that vocabulary is also that type of thing. They need to continue with their study.
Yeah.
I'd like. Is there one country, do you think, in the world today that's kind of leading the group? In
Oh,
use of,
well, I'm a bit biased because I'm working in Japan at the moment, but I see a lot of extensive reading going on in Japan. But I also see that, like participation in the Extensive Reading Foundation and so on, there's a lot of people working in Japan who are doing extensive reading and advocating extensive reading. And there are also some universities and schools which I think have just exemplary programs. They're better than any I've ever described, let alone, seen in action before in other places. And they're just really committing themselves to it. The reason I hesitated at passion before, the reason I'm afraid of passion is that you have to make sure that passion doesn't override common sense. And so, it's good to go at something with enthusiasm, but you always have to be a little bit cynical, I think, and thinks, are there other ways? Because passion tends to say that this is the only way to do it, this is the number one way, and I'm much more interested in a balance of opportunities, but making sure that each of those kinds of opportunities are there appropriately represented. And I wouldn't like to see any of them being overtaken by others. I think a good balance is a really important thing.